Thank you, Ginger. One of the things I love about working with Ginger is I don't need to talk to her before service. I just give her a topic, and she runs with it, and it's always perfect. And I was thinking that we almost don't even need to be here. We just need to listen to Ginger, and we have our lesson, and we have our spiritual experience. And I mean that very sincerely. So thank you.
Thank you.
And I have to include today Bobby and Arlen in that experience of just being in the flow, because their reading really it informed what I want to talk about today. When I realized that we're on the brink of another Passover, I know enough about Passover to know that I wanted to talk about freedom, and that's about all I know about it. But the readings were really perfect because it really caused me to stop and think and ask the question, well, what is freedom? And I'm curious if you've ever stopped to think about it. What is freedom? Because there's many different levels of freedom, right? To the ancient Jewish people, freedom was, freedom from bondage and slavery in Egypt. And it was escaping to the freedom of their own lands, right? So that was freedom. Many of us here are not in a place of physical bondage, although many people in our world today are, if they're in prison, if they're incarcerated, or they're in places of war and strife. That can be a physical prison, right? But we can be imprisoned just by our thoughts and our emotions, can't we? And we all know that. We've all experienced that at some point in our lives. So how do we escape that? How do we transition into a place of freedom? First, we need to know what we mean by freedom and what we think it is. So I'll tell you what I think it is. I think it is really transcending my limitations and my beliefs, which are of this world, really, right? My thoughts. And coming to the place of knowing in the moment the truth of who I am. And the truth of who I am is, that's the spirit, the divine, right? So to me, that's freedom. And how do I get to that place? How do I walk through my life, as Jesus said, being in the world but not of it? How do I walk through life not being caught and trapped by the circumstances and situations in my life? Because we all have situations. We all go through life with, tragedies and upsets and unhappiness. How do we walk through our life and not be trapped by that and really live the experience from a place of knowing that all is in divine order, that we are perfect, that every being that we are interacting with is the perfection of the divine as well. So, the reading today, Thich Nhat Hanh. Many of you may know him, but he was a Vietnamese Buddhist monk, and he was very well known during his lifetime, and he died a few years ago. I think maybe even last year. He was sick for a while, and then he finally passed away. He was in his mid-90s, though, and he was a very, and still is, venerable and revered spiritual teacher. And he was telling us in this reading that aimlessness is a way to freedom. He actually made that statement. Now, here in our country, if I were to say to you that I think you're an aimless being, or if I say to you I think your child is aimless, you might take offense at that, right? I mean, we don't think that's a good thing, not to have purpose, not to have goals in life. But here is this exalted spiritual being saying aimlessness is the way to freedom. And it's really a door to liberation, and it's actually essential to the liberated state. Liberated meaning free from suffering, because in Buddhism, if we're free from suffering, we're liberated, and we can actually reach enlightenment, which is the state of knowing and living and being our truth, right? So how do we become aimless? One of the things about being here at CCL, one of the things that I love is, in religious science, Ernest Holmes created the science of mind based on universal truths that we find in all spiritual traditions and all religions. So we see that here every week. We're talking about Judaism. Arlen spoke about Christianity, about Christ, and Bobby brought in religious science. Ernest Holmes was very well versed in, the Hindu scriptures and the Buddhist sacred texts. And his teachers were also, we just started a class here this week on the mysticism of Emma Curtis Hopkins, and she truly was a mystic. She truly lived her life, and you feel it when you read her writings, her original writings. You feel that she is walking in this world knowing the truth of her being. You just feel that energy. And how do we reach that state? So in those universal truths, how do I transcend, right? So if I'm in a state of upset, and it could be, I don't know, what's coming to mind are people that are people that I admire. I was once asked a question, I was in a workshop, write down 3 people that you admire, and the first one came to mind was Nelson Mandela. I truly admire that man. He was incarcerated for 26 years, and he was a rebel, and he was fighting for freedom in his country, and he was incarcerated for 26 years. And I've never read his book, but I can imagine that he probably was infused with a lot of very intense feelings about the state of his country and his own situation and his family. He came out of prison a changed man, right? He transcended or became aimless, and he went on to become the president of the South African Republic. How did he do that, right? Because he went within, right? I think of another person, Viktor Frankl. He was incarcerated in Germany during World War II and endured very harsh conditions himself, and he observed that in other people as well. And he went on to write a book called Man's Search for Meaning, and he created I guess it's a psychological way of dealing with life, a way of, for psychologists, I don't know, Holly might know more than me, it's not my field, but a way of sort of dealing with adverse circumstances in one's life. And you can't get more adverse than being in a concentration camp, right? So, every tradition and every life circumstance can really point us to how we can find freedom in our own life. And where does that freedom lie? Going back to the reading, and also Bobby's reading and Arlen's reading, it's really the spirit. We're all one, right? And that oneness is within ourselves. So if I'm aimless, if I truly have no goals in my life, and that doesn't mean in the secular way that I don't want to have a career, or I don't want to help somebody else or whatever, but if I can be open to spirit and what's flowing through my life, the inspiration, the divine inspiration, I can find freedom, right? Ernest Holmes himself experienced that. It was later on in his life, and his brother Fenwick wrote about him having a mystical experience. And, he was somebody who, he studied and he learned and he wrote and he spoke throughout his life. And he was a very gifted speaker. If you ever listen to his speeches, they're still available. But late in his life, he actually had a mystical experience, and his brother referred to it as being open at the top. And he really, I don't know how he would have expressed it at the time, but we would say he experienced God as himself, not within himself, but as himself, all right? And that's freedom. That's freedom. Because once you know the truth of your being, you're not subject to the vagaries of the human world anymore, right? And, I referred to Ginger and also, our 2 lovely readers over here, Bobby and Arlen, they were open at the top all week, creating these readings and selecting this beautiful music and bringing it to us. They were open at the top, listening to divine guidance, because we're all talking about freedom. So as I set an intention last week to talk about freedom today, they had the same intention, right? And that's all we needed. It all flowed from there, right? So going back to aimlessness, how do I become aimless in the Buddhist sense of the word? How do I not grasp and hold on? How do I allow spirit to move through me, right? And to inspire my life. You know, in the Tao Te Ching, often the Tao is described as a pendulum. And you know how a pendulum swings back and forth. And the place of, you know, when the pendulum is still, that's called harmonic resonance, and that's harmony, that's peace, that's love, right? And that is the vibration of the divine. Anything one way or the other is a variation off of that. And so if we were to take a pendulum on a clock, right, a grandfather clock, and just move it, it swings back and forth. And if we look at circumstances in the world or within our own life, if we try to change something and we have an intention, there's always, if something is moving, there's an equal and opposite action. So I'm moving it one way, and the pendulum goes the other way, and it swings back and forth, and it swings back and forth. And we can look at anything, like look at politics. Look at an issue that's salient in our political spectrum here in this country today. And I'm not going to mention anything specific because you can all imagine, you all know what's going on. But if you look historically, even over the last 50 years, and look at that issue and see how it's swung from one extreme to the other, it happens a lot, right? It happens in war. It happens in our personal lives as well. But if we can be in that place of peace and love and joy, in the harmonic resonance, which is where love resides, which is where the spirit is, if we can walk through the world in that place, we can be free from suffering, right? We can experience it. We know it's happening, as Thich Nhat Hanh said, but we can be free of anxiety. We can move in the world from a place of compassion and love and actually make a difference, all right? And we can be open at the top to receive divine guidance about knowing what actions to take in the world or not, just by being in that place of peace and love, right? Or aimlessness, right? So it's the difference between using our personal will. I want such and such to happen, you know, versus being open and receptive to what the divine will is that's flowing through us. And they might be the same thing, or they might not be, all right? But when we can take a moment and just breathe and just feel that divine energy flowing through us, we can always know the right thing to do. And oftentimes it's just to be. Right? We said in the affirmation, just being. And in the reading, we can just be the truth of who we are. And in that, we can really change the world. Can you imagine if every being on this planet, instead of being in their conflicted mind of ego and intention and grasping, if every being can be in a place of divine love and openness and receptivity, how would we relate to each other? Would there be wars in this country? Would there be dissonance and dissension and anger and hatred? You know, it's a world that we can imagine. We can think about it and imagine it in our visioning and in our prayers, because it is possible, but certainly at this moment it's not happening. We all know that, right? So how can we, each one of us, be that peace? All right. So what's another word for aimlessness? I can think of lots of them. Surrender is a big one. Non-attachment. Anything else? Letting go. Release. Ginger clearly thought of that word. Our next song, release and let go. Empty mind. Beautiful. Yeah. Clearing our mind of intentions and allowing Spirit to move through us. All right. So that is a place of peace. How can we get there? If we're in a place of upset, how can we get to a place of peace? A place from where we can really make change in the world just by being who we are. We don't have to do anything, we can just be. How can we get there? Breathe, yes. Choose again. Beautiful. Yeah, sorry? Meditation. Yeah. Yeah. What about prayer? It's another one. Meditation is part of our prayer, our affirmative prayer, isn't it? Love. Just be in love, right? Yeah. Gratitude. Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes when we're in a place of upset, we forget to be in those places. We forget to stop and think about gratitude or about breathing or about loving, about clearing our mind and being mindless, right? We just forget to do that, and we start to act, and then there's a reaction, and then we act again, and we're in a place of, it can be a cyclone within ourselves, right? So, our practitioner class talked about this week. How can we be in a place of presence every moment of my life? Now, that might not be possible every single moment, but how can we bring ourselves back? When we find ourselves being upset, when we find ourselves being in a place of turmoil, when we find ourselves being in a place where we know we might say something or do something that we really didn't want to do, that could be hurtful, that could create with another person, how can we bring ourselves out of it and bring ourselves into truth? Right? So all of these things we meant, stopping and breathing, right? Or clearing our mind. Press the pause button. That's a good one. You have a little button, don't you? You have a button in ours that says, oh, the easy button. Yeah, just stopping, right? Right? And then from there can slip into that place of harmonic dissonance, that is the Tao, which is knowing the presence of God within us. And when we're in that place, no matter what's happening around us, even if we're in conflict with another person, even if we're in a situation where we feel deeply uncomfortable and at unease, we've all been in those situations, even when we're in those places, once we center ourselves and remember the truth of our being, and we just be, then we are at peace. And that is a place of freedom. Because then we are free to choose again. And we can choose through divine inspiration what's coming through us. We can stop, we can breathe, we can surrender, and then we can feel what's happening here. How am I being? Allowing all things to be exactly as they are. Yeah. Because here, especially in the Western world, our tendency is we always want to fix things and change things. We all do that. We do it with our children. We do it with our spouses. We do it at work. We do it everywhere. That's what we do. This is the opposite of that. This is just taking time to pause and to breathe and to allow and just be, and allow all things to be as they are. And then, if we are inspired to take action, we know it's coming from a sacred place, right? And that's freedom for ourselves, and we're spreading freedom to other people. So thank you all for listening and for joining with me in freedom.
Reverend Christina.